Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this side event sponsored by UN Watch and NGO Monitor on international humanitarian law and the 2014 Gaza conflict. We will have two separate panels in the session. The first panel are the speakers appearing before you. We will hear first from Rubin, then from Herzberg, then from Jonathan Schanzer, and then from Professor Gerald Steinberg. That will be the first panel. And the second panel will be our military officers, Major General Michael Jones, Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey and Colonel Richard Kemp on the second panel. I'll just say a word or two before giving the floor to Rubin. This panel is being webcast live. Those who want to tweet it and share it on social media, the link is unwatch.org/Gaza response. So www.unwatch.org/Gaza response. And there's also a YouTube link which you can embed as desired. Just a word or two for those who've just arrived from the outside and who are watching. Today was the presentation upstairs in the plenary of the UN Human Rights Council of the report of the Commission of Inquiry into the Gaza conflict from last summer. And this is an occasion to have the first substantial response by experts from around the world. And this first panel are all individuals who contributed to this book, which is released here for the first time, Filling in the Blanks, publication of UN Watch and NGO Monitor, edited by Gerald Steinberg and Herzberg, and they'll tell you more about the book in a moment. With that, I want to give the floor to Rubin, the founder of the Israel Missile Defense Organization, to share with a summary of his contribution to this document, Filling in the Blanks, things that don't appear anywhere in the Gaza report, but which we think are highly relevant. Uzi.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation, UN Watch and NGO Watch, for invitation to speak here about a subject which I've been following very closely in the last decade and a half. The assault from Gaza on Israel's civilian population. It's now 14 years on, and it's still counting, because it's not over. We are getting the drizzle of rockets that you don't hear about in the news. From time to time, just this month, 5 incidents, 5 times, residents of Israel villages near Gaza had to run to the shelters. Again, it doesn't hit the news, it's below the radar. But this is the lives of people, and it's still going on with no end in sight. Now, the history of, I'm an engineer, so I follow the engineering side of it very avidly. The history of rocket weapons in Gaza started in the early 2000s when Hamas looked for a way to participate in the Second Intifada without crossing the border. And they hit the idea of making rockets at home, in kitchens. They make the propellant from sugar and fertilizer. Here is the fertilizer bought from Israel. You can see the Hebrew words. This is a fertilizer supplied to them as civilian goods for their agriculture. It's being used here, as you can see, to make propellant for rockets. They used steel pipes that we sold them for irrigation. And from that, you see the rockets. They have dozens of types of them, those homemade rockets. We call the first one, they call them Qassam. So we call all of them Qassams, all these homemade ones. The second stage, it was no definitions, going overlapping. Second stage was importation of ready-made rockets from factories, well-made rockets, military grade. You can see here 2 shipments that were caught. This is a Karin A ship in 2004 with mortars and mortar bombs and rockets. And this is the latest incident of Syrian-made rockets. Tried to smuggle them into Gaza through Iran. This was caught in May last year. So imported rockets started being smuggled in through the tunnels and through the sea. And the third stage was the setting up of veritable military industries. It's where we are now. They have military industries, probably 2 clusters of military industries, one for the Hamas and one for the Islamic Jihad, but there are at least 5 other groups that also have their own rockets. And you can see here the mass production. These are Grad-like rockets. I'll talk about the types in a minute. Usually the numbers there denote the range. So you have 40 and here is 105. Doesn't mean that it goes to 105, but that's what the design range is. They make very elaborate launchers, multi-barrel launchers at home. This is not smuggled, this is manufactured in Gaza. One of the rockets, M75, again, the 75 denotes the design range, 75 kilometers, which is the distance between Gaza City and downtown Tel Aviv. So that's where we are now. They have the industries. The Iranians helped them set it up. They smuggled the machinery in. They brought Palestinians out and flew them to Iran, taught them on-the-job training in their military industries, and smuggled them back into Gaza. So this industry is there, and it's right now, as we are speaking, working full blast, filling back the stockpiles that were depleted in last summer's fighting. The types, generally the types that they have, you see here a poster, a Palestinian poster, showing what types of rockets they have, the small one to the Qassam, to the largest one, which they call R160. Again, remember, the number denotes the range. 160 means 160 kilometers. And here is the map of the targets. They are in Arabic, all of them well within Israel, Beersheba, Ashdod, Tel Aviv, Haifa. Those are their targets. I mean, they are not making two-face of it. This is not military targets. Those are cities. Summing up more or less what the major type, they have hundreds of types of rockets, but the major types, they have the mortar bombs, various diameters of calibers of mortars, but most prevalent 120 millimeters with a range of 7 kilometers usually when its range force is 10 kilometers, and the warhead, the bomb, is 13 kilogram. The Qassams of all kinds is a family somewhere between 5 and 15 kilometers. That's more or less the upper limit. And the warheads are relatively small, 5 to 10 kilograms. The Grad, which is factory-made, smuggled into Gaza Strip to the tunnels, but this is made in factories in Iran. Range is 43 kilometers. And warhead, here we have a number because it comes up from the literature, 18.2 kilograms exactly. M75 is the rocket that you saw, which is supposed to reach 75 kilometers. It doesn't go exactly 75, about 70, 71, and it has all kinds of variants. They have 3 or 4 different types with different names, but all of them revolve around this diameter and this size, approximately 70 kilograms. The warheads vary between 45 and about 50 kilometers. Fajr 5 is an Iranian rocket, a heavy rocket, comparable to the American MLRS, with a very heavy warhead of 175 kilograms. They managed to smuggle in the shipment. Some of them were destroyed in a preemptive strike of Israel in 2012. Some of them were fired at Tel Aviv, and even a few were fired last year at Tel Aviv too. R160, as I said, this is a mystery rocket. They have a rocket that is supposed to reach Haifa, 160 kilometers away. They fired several of them last summer. We recorded 4 such incidents. They claimed that they fired 11 of them at Haifa. Haifa was alerted, not from the north, it was alerted from rockets coming from the south. And the warhead is perhaps about 50 kilograms. Now, where they deploy them is also very interesting. When they, with the short-range stuff that they made in the early 2000s, they fired them from near the border, in the outlined in the dunes, in the sand dunes, in the fields, in the orange groves. But when the range grew up, they moved back into their own towns and their own cities and are deploying them, especially after Second Lebanon War, when they copied the Hamas, the Hezbollah, and started building buried launcher inside their cities, using human shielding, exactly as the Hezbollah, in order to protect their launch site. You see a buried launcher with several rockets in the courtyard of a house. You can see the wall here, you can see the tree there. Here you see a salvo going to Israel last summer. Actually, if you look at, you take a map of Gaza, you can pinpoint the street and the street number. But the most interesting place, and you open the Google, you find dozens of them, dozens of launcher sites inside Gaza City or Khan Yunis or other cities. Here is interesting, there is an Al-Mashtal 5-star hotel built, believe, in 2011. It's a 5-star hotel. You can reserve, open the Google. I tried before this meeting, I opened it up. You can make a reservation there. It was built in 2011 in the middle of the so-called siege. So if you are a guest there, you can enjoy the swimming pool and other amenities, and in wartime you can also enjoy firing rockets from the porch of the coffee shop and notice that they have an empty area here, which is a training area of the Hamas. But the launcher is not there. The launcher is here, at the foothill, because it's full of journalists. So very clever how to prevent Israel from destroying this thing. This hotel is not, as far as I know, it's not hit until this very day. Looking at the numbers, statistics, I won't go into the whole set of numbers, but counting according to our sources, they fired during these 14 years almost 20,000 rockets and mortar bombs. They killed 82 Israelis, mostly civilian, but some soldiers too, and they wounded at least 2,000. The total number of wounds is much higher because you have to include also the stress cases in it. That's what happened during these 14 years, but you know, the warheads are not large. So you see, each warhead is small, but with such numbers, staggering numbers, they add up. And when you take with some simplifying assumptions how many rockets were fired of each type, when they fired at Tel Aviv, it must be M75, because nothing else reaches Tel Aviv, or Fajrs. When they fired the Gaza Strip, the neighborhoods near Gaza Strip, so it must be the Qassam. So you make the simplifying assumption, and you come to the amazing number of 187 tons of warheads that they dropped on Israel during this campaign until now. This is, ladies and gentlemen, the bomb load of 6 B-52s, believe it or not. Each warhead is small, but with the numbers, they add up. Just for an example, last summer, we counted 134 rockets that were aimed at Tel Aviv. Some hit MTRs, some were destroyed. They add up to 6 tons of warheads. 6 tons of warheads, so two F-16s. On Ashdod, smaller rockets, but 371 of them. It adds to 7 tons. And like this, 5.5 tons on Beersheba. This is tonnage. This makes a difference. This makes damage, and this kill people. And you see what the results are. First, they are terrorizing people. You see some picture, a girl running into a shelter in Sderot, people running to shelter in Beersheba, a kindergarten during an alarm. The stress, you can see it in the book, the stress and the post-stress, hundreds of thousands of trauma cases in Israel because of that. Destroying property, a house in Beersheba, this was last summer. Beersheba, again, a school in Beersheba too, a house in 2012 in Tel Aviv, upper story demolished, a fire in a factory in Sderot, which was completely burned down and lost. The total damages that we figure out, beyond the cost of the war itself, just the economic cost is about 21 billion shekels, which is about $5.6 billion. Now, I quote one Palestinian official, Ahmad Youssef, who was an advisor to Ismail Haniyeh. He made a statement, I found that you'll find in the book and the source too, that Hamas rockets are fireworks. They kill so few Israelis. I mean, with 20,000 rockets and mortar bombs, they killed only 82 Israelis. It's a small number. Each one is a lifetime. Each one is a funeral. Each one is a story, but it's few. So he's not the only one. I personally saw Palestinians claiming in meetings that those are fireworks, political statements. Let me address this issue. Are those fireworks, or is the amount of casualties result of luck? I, as an engineer, learned that for luck you have to work very hard, and we worked very hard for this luck. The state of Israel has spent a tremendous effort and fortune to build up defenses against those rockets during the last 14 years. The first line of defense in Israel Homeland Defense is early warning. We have early warning for citizens, sometimes as short as 15 seconds. You have in 15 seconds, you have to run and find a shelter, but it helps, it saves lives. We developed those radars early on, a nationwide alert system, an efficient emergency aid system that saves lives too. So this is the first line of defense. The second line of defense was passive sheltering. Israel spent billions of dollars in vast construction program to defend its citizens, private sheltering, public sheltering, school sheltering. Look at that, the school They spent, I don't know how much money in order to shelter so that the children will be killed during the night. Not the whole school is protected. The children have to run from the unprotected part to the protected part during this brief time between alert and the fall of the rocket. And last but not, I couldn't prevent commenting that there is also a vast construction project going on in Gaza right now. There it is. It's not for the citizens. Nobody is sheltered. It's for the Hamas tunnels and Hamas command centers. And finally, last but not least, our active defense system that shoot rockets out of the sky, but this is the last line of defense. As I said, there are two other layers. This is the command and control, the emergency services, the passive defense, and finally the active defense, which makes a difference. So to conclude with this very brief presentation of 14 years of assault and Israeli defense, the Gaza rockets are not fireworks. They are lethal weapons designed to kill. Each warhead contains steel balls and steel shards in order to increase the effect of the warhead to kill people in the open. Since the first two victims fell in 2014, the grandfather who came to pick up his grandchild from the kindergarten in Sderot, in August 2014, a warhead fell by them. It wasn't a big one, but enough to kill both of them. Since then, losses were mounting, and if they didn't mount more than that, it's because of all our defenses. All our efforts that I showed you, I estimate, if they wouldn't have been taken, the number of casualties would have been between 10 and 20 times more. That means between 820 dead killed to 1,600 killed during this, if we wouldn't have taken all these steps. Government of Israel will continue to defend its citizens. Israel is continuing to improve its defenses. More passive defense are built, more sheltering is built as we are speaking, as we say, this is going on. More active defense is put on our command and control system. Is being improved all the time because we don't see the other side assisting for making those rockets. The factories are working there, and one day, today they are still flying in small numbers, one day it will burst out again. And with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
I know you have to go to the airport, so thank you very much for being with us, and we appreciate your important contribution, understanding the thousands of rockets, the nearly 20,000 rockets that have been fired at Israel for the past 10 or so years is a factor that should be taken into account, and in my opinion, the report did not meaningfully take this into account. I do want to note that we have members of the press corps who are joining us, and I appreciate your presence here and the fact that we had a press conference earlier today on a very busy day, and I'm appreciative to the Journalists Union, ACANU, here at the United Nations that hosted our military experts panel, from whom we'll hear in a few minutes. With that, I would like to turn over the floor to the legal advisor of NGO Monitor and Herzberg to present today's book.
Thank you, Hillel. We're going to do it a little bit opposite today because Uzi had to leave to catch a plane, so I'm going to be making some introductory remarks now about our book. First, though, I want to thank UN Watch for their collaboration on our project and for on this event. And also, I wanted to acknowledge the important contribution of the JINSA task force, and we're really honored to have him here to present later in today's event. So we can see when the HRC established yet another commission of inquiry targeting Israel, Hillel, Professor Steinberg, and I, and a few other people got together and thought about what could our contribution be to this upcoming commission of inquiry. And at first we thought it might be interesting to gather a panel of experts and maybe do our own commission. But when we realized the resources that would be needed to do such a project and the intense amount of work and the information that one would need to gather in order to carry that out, we decided that that wasn't necessarily feasible. So instead, we decided to gather a group of experts to write about aspects of the Gaza conflict that you don't normally hear in the UN. Past reports, past commissions of inquiry, the Goldstone report in particular, have contained several errors. They have erased critical context. They have failed to adhere to international fact-finding standards and have contained profound distortions of international law and military operations. And we thought it was important that we write a report to address these failings and to essentially fill in the blanks of what would be the upcoming Chavis, now Davis report. So in addition to the contribution we heard from Uzi Rubin, and I should just mention that he was the individual that conceived of, initiated, and managed Israel's first missile defense project, the Arrow project. We will be having Jonathan Schanzer, who's Vice President of Research for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, speaking about Hamas's terror financing network, and Professor Gerald Steinberg, who's the president of NGO Monitor and also a professor of political science at Bar-Ilan University, will be speaking about methodologies in the report and also about the considerable influence of organizations on the outcome of the report's contents. And part 2 of our event will address the troubling legal and military aspects found in the Chavis-Davis report. And we have Colonel Richard Kemp, Major General Michael Jones, and Professor Jeff Korn to speak about those aspects. We hope our event this evening will provide you with that missing context that you didn't hear this morning when Mary McGowan Davis presented her report. And probably also, some of the things you'll hear tonight will probably be the first time you've ever heard them in a UN framework. So we're honored that we can provide this platform to the people here, and we hope you find it interesting and enjoyable. So thanks very much. And I'll turn it over now to Jonathan Schanzer.
Thank you very much, Ann. On behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Washington-based think tank, I'm very pleased to be with you here today to be able to provide some of the financial context for the report that was debated earlier today. I should state up front that the HRC report really ignores the financial narrative completely. This should not come as a surprise, quite frankly, because if you look at the way that the United Nations approaches Hamas and Hamas finance, it's actually not something that the UN chooses to track. If you look at the UN 1267 committee, which is the primary body for tracking terror finance, they do not include Hamas, nor Hezbollah, nor a host of other terrorist organizations. They just choose not to track it. To provide a little bit of context before we dive into what happened last summer, I thought it would just be important to sort of trace very briefly the history of Hamas finance. This is an organization that was founded in 1987, primarily off of Gulf Arab funding, as well as informal networks. By the year 1995, it set up its headquarters in Damascus, and this marked a real shift for the organization, where it became increasingly part of the Iranian axis, if you will. This is working with Syria as well as Iran and Hezbollah. All together they formed an axis in this way. And this came with great perks for Hamas. This meant that Hamas was receiving arms, it was receiving training, and it was getting rockets that were sent to Sudan, then transferred up through Egypt, through the Sinai Peninsula, and then into the Gaza Strip. And then probably more importantly, the figures that have been thrown around, it's not as if Hamas settles up at Deloitte accounting at the end of every year, but the assumption is that they were receiving more than $400 million per year from the Iranians. Now, all of that came to an abrupt halt in 2012. This, of course, is as the Syrian civil war erupts. Hamas finds itself in a very difficult position where they do not want to continue to cooperate with the Syrian regime or with the Iranians because of the slaughter of Syrians, Sunnis, in Syria, as well as the slaughter of Palestinians. Many have been killed there as well. And so there was a rupture within the axis, and as a result, Hamas decides to leave these Damascus headquarters, and as a result needs to actually turn away upwards of $450 million, if you're to believe those reports. And so it's at that point that Hamas begins to look for new regional patrons. This is during the time of the Arab Spring, and luckily for Hamas, they find support from the new president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi. It's during the time of Mohamed Morsi's time in office, about 1 year, that Cairo became the back office for Hamas. This is the way that more than one intelligence officer explained this to me, that there was as much as $1 billion worth of money as well as goods and services that were flowing in the tunnels connecting the Sinai Peninsula to the Gaza Strip. This, of course, was exploiting the legal blockade of the Gaza Strip. They had created this underground economy through which Hamas could prosper. And so we're talking about the transfer of untold numbers of weapons, the rockets that you heard Rubin describe, cash. It's a term that we use at the Treasury Department, just called bulk cash smuggling. It's a very fancy way of saying carrying suitcases or trash bags full of cash to replenish the banks in the Gaza Strip. And then on top of that, there was the goods that were being smuggled between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. And this is no less important, not because there were TVs or clothing or food that was coming in. Of course, all of that was coming in along with all sorts of other reports about Viagra and other things that you wouldn't think is essential goods going into the Gaza Strip. But more importantly, Hamas was taxing these goods. 10, upwards of 20, perhaps even 30%, depending on the reports that we heard. And so this enabled Hamas to reap a huge amount of money during this time when Morsi was in power. But that all came to an abrupt halt again 1 year later. This coincided with the rise of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the new leader of Egypt, who has since shut down upwards of 2,000 of those smuggling tunnels. Essentially, within months, destroyed Hamas's economy. Now, this was, of course, because of the fact that Hamas has long been a splinter of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, and the Egyptians are opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood. They see this as a threat to the new regime. And so Hamas is now forced to scramble yet again. Having lost one patron and then another major patron, they start to look around. That's when we see the unity government that is forged between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas just before the outbreak of the war last summer. And the goal there was essentially to try to get the Palestinian Authority to allow for the greater flow of goods and services to the Gaza Strip. The goal was to have the Palestinian Authority provide a sort of assurance to the international community that they would be able to oversee and make sure that rockets and other weaponry would not get through. And when that fails, of course, the unity government was, it was forged, but it didn't really take hold. The factions were not able to agree on much of anything. And it's at that point that we begin to see a real fracturing within Hamas, and we start to see factions begin to take matters into their own hands. And that's, of course, when we see the kidnapping and killing of those 3 teens in the West Bank last summer. This was an attack, as we now understand, that was ordered by not the Gaza branch of Hamas, but by the Turkish headquarters of Hamas. A man by the name of Saleh Aruri, who is a fundraiser, as well as the founder of the Qassam Brigades in the West Bank, the armed wing of Hamas. He later took credit for this attack in front of no less than 1,000 people, and also the deputy prime minister of Turkey, while in Istanbul. And so we began to learn more about this Turkish branch of Hamas. As it turns out, there are 11 figures who were transferred there as a result of the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap. On top of that, 2 financiers that are located inside Turkey that are dealing with Hamas finances on a regular basis. And then we also learned toward the end of the summer that the traditional envoy between Hamas and Iran, a man who has been procuring all of the weapons and cash from Iran, his name is Imad al-Alami. He was then transferred as well to Turkey, allegedly for medical treatment, but it's not known whether he stayed or not. So we were seeing a huge sort of contingent of Hamas activity over there. And in the meantime, we heard about reports coming out of the West Bank in particular that there was as much as $100 million being transferred from Turkey to the Hamas organization. Those estimates now have creeped up to about $150 million. And so Turkey is one of the largest sponsors of Hamas today. This is, of course, a remarkable development given the fact that it is a NATO member. On top of Turkey, we saw Qatari activity as well. Everybody probably remembers that in 2012, the Emir of Qatar, Hamad, visited the Gaza Strip after Hamas took it over by force and pledged $400 million. Since then, the estimates have been downgraded on a yearly basis to roughly 100 to 150 million per year being provided to the Hamas government in Gaza. And of course, we know that there is a headquarters in Qatar as well, where Khalid Meshal, the head of the Hamas policy, is based there, as well as the spokesman and several others. To sort of wrap up here, the assumption right now is that Turkey and Qatar remain the sole patrons of Hamas. I don't believe that that's true. We continue to see a fracturing from within the Hamas organization. There's the West Bank leadership, there's the Gaza leadership, there's the Politburo, and then of course there's the Qassam Brigades, the so-called armed wing of Hamas. The Qassam Brigades still maintains very strong ties with Iran. This means that rockets and training and yes, tunnel digging facilities, all of these things are still provided by Iran in the hopes that they can continue to bring Hamas closer, bring it back from the rupture that first came about in 2012. The thing that I would want to just make a note about here is that, of course, we are on the precipice of a nuclear deal with Iran that would yield Iran upwards of $150 billion in sanctions relief. This funding will undoubtedly flow to the likes of Hamas as well as Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies. This is a major danger. Now, again, just to reiterate here that there was nothing mentioned in this report about Hamas finance. We did not hear about the Qataris. We did not hear about the Turks. We did not hear about the Iranians and their provision of cash, assistance, safe harbor. These were crucial to allowing this conflict to erupt and to enabling Hamas to continue to fight throughout the summer, and it will enable Hamas to continue to fight for years to come. Ignoring all of this is essentially tacit approval, and it's for this reason that I think that this report was not just incomplete, it was dangerous. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. When we sat down almost about 8 or 9 months ago and tried to examine what we were going to expect, what was then called the Shavis Commission, the Commission of Inquiry, COI, we had the model of the Goldstone report. Now, to his credit, Judge Goldstone recognized a number of months after he published that report and presented it here, that in fact, his report that had his name on it, almost 500 pages, was essentially devoid of facts. It was a compilation of NGO allegations, accusations, claims, myths, slogans, but no military expertise. They were writing a report about a war, and there was no military expertise. They didn't want to hear from military experts who actually knew something. What they did was they cut and paste from NGO reports. And to his credit, Judge Goldstone, as he became aware day after day after the report was published of, I'll use the term inadequacies, but I think that's an inadequate term, of that report that had his name on it, he had the courage to write an article in the Washington Post and said, if I had known then what I know now, I would not have published this report. What did he know? He knew that the basic allegations, the entire purpose of this exercise, to blame Israel, to accuse Israel, the modern blood libel, that Israel was intentionally killing civilians in Gaza, was false. Unfortunately, we're now back in a similar situation. Professor William Shavis became the next Goldstone, chosen by the countries that form the majority of the UN Human Rights Council, to prepare another such indictment, the same methodology. Now, Professor Shavis was forced to resign, I should say, before he finished that report, although he claims to have written most of the report before. And Mary McGowan Davis then inherited the same process. And when we look at this report, there's some differences. In the Goldstone report, there was almost no mention of Hamas rockets. I think there were a page or two. But none of what we heard today from Rubin none of the details. There were 4,563 rockets and mortars fired at Israel. Every one is a war crime. But since none of the NGO community that forms the foundation for the political activities that go on under the guise of the Human Rights Council cared or reported or were interested in the details of this industry of taking humanitarian aid and using it for rockets to attack Israeli civilians, it didn't get into these reports. Same thing's true with concrete or the Iranian connection. Those are all war crimes, and yet they're somehow missing. The problem with this process, the problems with this process, there are many of them. I don't have time to go, we'll be here forever. But the problems begin with the political agenda. They go on to the absence of fact-finding, what I call faith-based research. When you read the reports, you do not see any real fact-finding, no methodologies. Amnesty International says, B'Tselem, I think, was quoted 69 times in this report. B'Tselem says. All sorts of other NGOs, Physicians for Human Rights Israel say, Medical Aid for Palestinians say. But what is the basis for these claims? Those questions were not asked. That's basically the agenda that NGO Monitor has set for itself. Focusing on what is very important to the human rights community and has gone bad. Those NGOs that claim to have expertise in human rights, in humanitarian aid, in military confrontation, who write these reports that are almost instantly adopted, repeated in the media, and in UN reports and then by diplomats, and examine independently what they know, or in most cases, what they don't know. And this faith-based approach to human rights, to accusations, is very, very dominant. And we documented that, this group of us sitting at this table and some others, in this volume called Filling in the Blanks. I was asked recently, what was the basis for choosing the subjects that we looked at, which you're hearing about today? It wasn't faith-based. It was because we've seen the pattern. From 2002, the false allegations of Jenin massacre, which is still on websites of NGOs and is still sometimes referred to, sometimes a little bit, rounded off a little bit, in using terms like Israeli human rights violations, Israeli violations of international law, war crimes. That's the term that we still see very often. And it goes all the way through the Lebanon War and the Goldstone Report and Beit Hanun and many other examples. And so this volume was designed to fill in, literally that's the title, to fill in the blanks. And to point out what the foundations, the NGOs in particular, knew, which was very little, and what they didn't know, what their agendas were and what they were not. I want to take one or two examples. One of the most controversial aspects of each of these confrontations, unfortunately, is the question of who are the people who died in Gaza. How many of them are civilians? How many of them are children? Basic answer is it's very hard to judge because there's a lot of propaganda. There are a couple of sets of statistics. There's the Palestinian Ministry of Health, which is essentially Hamas in Gaza. I would say take those numbers with some caution. And then there's something called the UNHRC Office for the Commissioner for Humanitarian Assistance. That's why we have a legal advisor here. OCHA, which has a protection cluster, and they created this protection cluster because their numbers back in 2008, 2009 that were quoted in the Goldstone report were essentially what Goldstone said were never shown to be accurate. So they created a protection cluster. And that's quoted very widely in the, I was going to point to this, in the McGowan-Davis, the Shavis-Davis report, as we call it. Now, it's strange. One would have expected that Judge McGowan-Davis would have said, what is this protection cluster? Do they, in fact, know how many civilians were killed in Gaza and what the circumstances were? Do they know whether, in fact, there was not necessity, military necessity, whether there was disproportionality, a term that we heard many, many times this morning, unfortunately, in almost every case, used more as a political slogan than any kind of legal or moral framework. So this protection cluster that reported these numbers, supposedly independent of the Palestinian Ministry of Health, ergo Hamas, is composed of, ready for this, 3 NGOs. That's it. These NGOs are Al-Mazad, based in Gaza. The term NGO is quite problematic there. They are very much part of the promotion of the Hamas party line. The Palestinian Center for Human Rights, PCHR. Occasionally you'll see some criticism of the murder of collaborators, other Palestinian internal violations of human rights, but mostly it's again condemning Israel. And an Israeli NGO, B'Tselem. B'Tselem had nobody in Gaza. How did they know? How are they able to judge out of the Palestinian casualties that were reported who was a civilian, who was a combatant, who was a member of Hamas? Well, they made phone calls. They called the families, this is what they reported, and they asked, was your son, your daughter, your husband, your uncle, who was killed, was he a member of Hamas? Was he a militant? Was he a terrorist? They didn't ask, I don't think. That's not exactly what I would call fact-finding methodology. The other 2 organizations said that they went to the morgues and the hospitals. Well, I'm not quite sure how you determine who is a civilian, who is a combatant, who is a militant on the basis of that methodology. There are many people who lost their lives in this unfortunate war. Every war is unfortunate. In every war there are people who lose their lives, civilians. But to use that as the basis for accusations of war crimes, for demands of the involvement of the International Criminal Court, without any professional, credible, verifiable fact-finding methodology, is absurd. There's other language, but I think that's good enough for this purpose. And we have that documented in detail in this report. Now, what did the NGOs actually do? The NGO community actually do? They were very active, as they always are during this war, and they produced hundreds of publications almost every day throughout this period. I did not do a PowerPoint. I've learned this from Lizzie next time we do this. But if you look at the book, and you look at the tables that are there, we have listed, we have 5 major NGOs, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, Oxfam, the French organization Federation for International Human Rights, and Save the Children. And you see that during this period when there was a lot of fighting and unfortunately dying in Ukraine and Iraq and Syria, the bulk of their publications, their statements, their reports, their expert reports, sent out to the media, sent out to the United Nations and other organizations, focused in a very disproportionate, we heard the word disproportionate, in a very disproportionate manner against Israel. Time after time after time. Human Rights Watch put out 17 reports, Amnesty 27 in this 2-month conflict, and in Twitter, the head of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, tweeted 400 times on this conflict. And in each one of them, or in most of them, there were terms like war crimes, all of them targeting Israel. What you have is not just proportionality, you have an accession. And this is made available by the amount of money that goes into the NGO community. And that's where the governments come in. Because although we use the term NGO, non-governmental organization, or civil society, in fact, the vast majority are funded by governments. And that's a real problem. And they're funded by European governments as well, not just Qatar and other countries, but also European governments. Approximately 150 million euros, some kroners, some pounds, euros, dollars. That's a lot of money goes into the NGO community every year for attacks against Israel. And I think it's important to say, particularly here, this is not the entirety of the NGO community. There are many NGOs who have resisted becoming part of this propaganda warfare or demonization or political war against Israel. But the ones that we notice, the ones that we see, the ones that get the money are very often those that are involved under the framework of human rights, under the framework of humanitarian assistance, involved in this political warfare. And these organizations have failed in their duties. And they are picked up, quoted, cut and pasted into the kinds of reports that we heard presented this morning. There are a lot of recommendations that we make in this process, but since the time is limited, I'm going to just focus on one of them. The governments that provide this funding, the British government that provides the funding for medical aid for Palestinians, very centrally involved in false accusations. The Norwegian government that funds through NORWAC a gentleman by the name of doctor by the name of Mads Gilbert, one of 4 experts listed in this report. Another one is sitting in this room, Colonel Richard Kemp, who will soon address you. Richard, you might want to find out whether you can get your name removed from that not overly august company. When Mads Gilbert is listed as a medical expert by a UN report, there's something wrong with the system. So I would suggest that those member governments, not only of the Human Rights Council, but also who provide the funding through various frameworks, like the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, like the Norwegian Refugee Council, like so many of those frameworks, without the due diligence, without examining what is being done with that money, I think that is also an important outcome of this process, which can perhaps contribute to the restoration of the genuine moral universal foundations of human rights. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. And there are copies available of our book in the back, so feel free to take a copy. And as well, there are copies available on our website. And there are also copies of the Schanzer report that you will hear about in the next panel. So start part 2. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I want to thank all the members of the panel. In a moment, as the positions become available, to invite our next panel, the military officers, to come forward. And I'll just note a few things. The book that was presented here in this panel is available on the site of NGO Monitor, and the link is
www.ngo-monitor.org.
ngo-monitor.org, and you can find a PDF copy of this book on the homepage. I just want to recap some of the things that occurred today. Those who are watching by live webcast around the world, as we're about to switch panels. We began with the report of the Commission of Inquiry in Gaza was presented this morning at 9 a.m. There followed a 6-hour debate, 3 hours on the report itself, and then another 3 hours of general debate on Palestine. As you know, today was the agenda item 7. It is the agenda item on Palestine. On Israel, there is only one agenda item on one country at the Human Rights Council, and it's not North Korea or Sudan or China or Russia or Pakistan or Venezuela. It is only an agenda item on the state of Israel. And so the debate took place today for some 6 hours. And during that time, the 3 military officers who are joining this panel now as we speak, all of them intervened in the plenary and also spoke at a press conference. So we now have the chance to hear them. And then Colonel Kemp here is going to join us as well, and we'll, in a moment, we'll begin this panel. So it was a significant presentation. The individuals on this panel, each of them intervened in the Human Rights Council plenary. They spoke for 2 minutes each, but now with a chance to give them a more substantial amount of time to speak. They also had an opportunity to address the UN press corps and had a very serious interaction that lasted for an hour and a half. In between, they had to speak at the UN. So with that, I would like to introduce the members of our panel and give them the floor. And I'll just introduce them now, and then afterwards we'll give them the floor. To my immediate right is Major General Michael Jones. Among other things, he was the former Chief of Staff of U.S. Central Command. We are greatly fortunate to have someone with such significant warfighting experience to be with us here on the panel. Next to him is Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey. Both of them are retired military officers. Professor Korn is a law professor at the South Texas College. He's a presidential research professor. He formerly served as the senior law of war expert for the U.S. Army. Both of these individuals participated in a task force on the Gaza conflict commissioned by GINSA and published a significant report, which you can see on the website of GINSA. And with that, I will turn the floor over, I was privileged to turn the floor over to Major General Jones to introduce the report that they published and to present some of their findings with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here and for not only coming but staying for the second half of the program. My name is Mike Jones. I'm a retired U.S. Army general officer, and I participated in a study with 4 other retired general officers from the United States military. And this was a group of officers who are experienced Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps officers in combat, in legal targeting, and in conflict in urban areas. The report that we authored was GENSA sponsored, but an independent report by the 5 members of the study team. We were advised by a number of experts to include a military historian, Elliot Cohen, and also by Lieutenant Colonel Professor Geoffrey, an expert in law of armed conflict. The focus of our report was on what should the United States learn from the Gaza conflict. It was not an attempt to adjudicate the conflict or to somehow say who was right, who was wrong, and so forth, but it was really an attempt to find out what happened and what should we learn from it. In the process of doing that, however, we found information, made judgments and conclusions that I believe are relevant in terms of information to the Commission of Inquiry report. And so that's why we're here, is to share some of that information. Our conclusions and recommendations really fall into several major areas, and I'll address each of the major areas. First of all, is the nature of how conflict is evolving. And that is the nature of conflict is creating a state where non-state organizations are in fact gaining the capability that have traditionally been in the domain of nation states. And specifically in the case of Hamas, a standing army that is well organized, it is trained, it is well equipped, it has operating doctrine that is published and promulgated to its subordinate units, and it has a lethality that is equal to, or in some cases exceeds, that of many nation states. They operate over the spectrum of conflict, not just as insurgents, but they operate in the spectrum of conflict from terrorism, insurgency, all the way to conventional operations. They're organized with not just infantry brigades and so forth, but with specialized organizations for intelligence, for logistics, special operations forces, and the like. What you would expect to see in any conventional force or military force of a nation. However, as demonstrated today, they operate without the same level of international scrutiny, in some cases accountability. Secondly, the second major area that we reached conclusions in were about the tactical innovations by Hamas and other armed groups that were operating from Gaza. These new innovations ranged from things such as new tunneling capability to both hide from modern reconnaissance and to use as a method to protect themselves and their resources, but also to use it as a form of maneuver against enemy forces to both infiltrate behind enemy lines and also to maneuver against active engagements. Now, tunneling is not necessarily a new technique, but the way in which it was used and the rapidity of how quickly they were able to create these tunnels, which were fairly sophisticated, that had electricity and lights and communications lines and so forth in them, was something fairly new. Much as trenches were used in World War I to create the ability to maneuver on a battlefield that otherwise people were not able to. We believe that Hamas came up with this technique to restore their ability to maneuver. One of the differences, though, is that rather than trench lines, these are tunnels that are in built-up areas, dense urban areas, often originated inside of homes, private houses, protected areas like mosques and other locations that are not normally places where military forces would be operating. So you had those type of innovative techniques that Hamas implemented. There were a number of others that are in the report that you can read. And it ranged all the way to other techniques to position themselves and to blend in with the civilian population in order to do several things. First of all, by blending with the civilian population, knowing that their enemy would abide by the law of armed conflict and include the danger of collateral damage in their calculation in making an attack decision, that it was a way to try to protect themselves. But the other thing that we concluded was, by virtue of their location, was to ensure that the attacks that inevitably would occur would in fact produce the kinds of civilian casualties and collateral damage that they could then use to exploit in the international information domain. We saw this both in the doctrinal manual that Hamas had produced and disseminated to its forces, as well as conclusive information about their behavior. The third area was what I would group in the very capable Hamas information campaign, using both the public media and social media to accomplish their broader objectives. Our group came to the conclusion that Hamas and other armed groups escalated military operations with no misperception or even intent to defeat Israeli Defense Forces militarily. There was no concept that they thought that they would somehow win a military victory. Rather, it was clear to us that their strategic intent was to win the information war, with military operations and activities supporting the information effort. More importantly, through the manipulation of public media access and innovative use of social media, we believe that Hamas exploited the civilian casualties that it may not have caused, but was certainly responsible for. And this is an important distinction that I think we should make. I think it's very important to distinguish between what the cause of collateral damage is and where the responsibility lies for the collateral damage. So for example, if as a military commander, I locate my launch sites for artillery or rocket fire or something in a protected area, knowing that the response of any force that's being attacked by that rocket fire is going to fire counter battery fire, then it may be that that counter fire caused the damage, but the responsibility for the damage lies with the people who located it there in the first place. And so that's, I think, a very important distinction. And what we saw was that for their positioning, knowing that there would be civilian casualties and collateral damage, that was done in order to gain international sympathy and to fuel the fourth major area of our conclusions. And that is that Hamas exploited the conflict to engage in a new type of conflict that's commonly called the lawfare in certain circles. Now I'll defer the more detailed discussion of this lawfare issue to Lieutenant Colonel and Professor Horn, who's an expert in international humanitarian law. And in the U.S. terms, what we call that is the law of armed conflict. But I do want to make a couple comments about this engagement in this new area. Unlike the composition of the Commission of Inquiry, our team are experts in both the theory and the practice of having to fight complex, to include in urban areas, and in applying international law in combat. And so we felt that we had one significant difference between us and members of the Commission. However, additionally, we had access, in part, because of our experience and our professionalism, to information and insights from officials in all three parties. That included the Israelis, the United Nations, and the Palestinian Authority. Now, we did not do a comprehensive strike-by-strike assessment of all of the engagements in the war. However, based on a considerable amount of intelligence information, targeting information, and discussion with the parties, we came to very different conclusions than the Commission of Inquiry did regarding the lawfulness of the conduct of the parties. And that is specifically, we found that the Israeli Defense Forces systematically, through both procedures and previous training, abided by the law of armed conflict in their targeting and their operations. Now, that's not to say that the IDF was infallible, and there may not have been mistakes made, and there may not have been issues, but as a whole, when we looked at all of the body of knowledge that we had access to, in our judgment, the IDF deliberately complied with the law of armed conflict and its targeting, and it did not indiscriminately kill civilians. Conversely, Hamas and the other armed groups in Gaza purposely and habitually violated international law in several areas. The first, the majority of its rocket and mortar fires were either indiscriminate or targeted against civilian populations, which even in the report that we saw released today was very clear. Additionally, they located their firing positions, their command and control headquarters, their arms and weapons storage, ammunition storage deliberately in civilian locations where combat would inevitably result in civilian casualties. And they did this without military necessity to do so. Military necessity is a very important point. There sometimes is a misconception that the only place one could put a firing position in Gaza is in an urban built-up area, and nothing could be further from the truth. There are many areas that are not built-up areas in Gaza. If you were going to build a tunnel in order to then protect the firing position, there's no reason on earth that you would have to build it so that the firing position was next to a UN compound. There are plenty of places you could build that exact same tunnel to go into an agricultural field or some area that was not populated. So this, in our judgment, was a deliberate effort on the part of the combatant groups in Gaza. And of course, failure to distinguish themselves as combatants and in fact purposely blending in with civilians is clearly another violation of international law and the law of armed conflict. So with that, what I would like to do is turn it over to Colonel Horn and let him talk a little bit more about the legal issues and the way that we kind of looked at this in the report.
First off, I'd like to express my gratitude to all of you for taking the time to listen to this presentation and to thoughtfully consider our views on the conflict in Gaza and also our reaction to the report that was issued today. And I'd like to thank the sponsors for giving me the opportunity to participate both in the assessment prepared by the generals and also in this event. My background was already explained, but I'd like to offer for you my personal motivation for being involved in this effort. I'm a passionate believer that war must be regulated by law, and that humanitarian law plays a vital role in mitigating the suffering of war. But I also believe passionately that the law must continue to manifest the inherent balance that's been central to its evolution since inception, which is a balance between military necessity and humanity. And so my concern is that when interpretations of the law distort that balance to one extreme or the other, it creates a false narrative of what the law requires. And warfighters in the future don't get often to choose the wars they're asked to fight. Their nations require them to do it, and we live in a very chaotic world. I think all of you recognize that the ability to predict whose military is going to have to be fighting what conflict in the next month or the next year or the next decade is impossible. But when these forces are asked by their nation or told by their nation to engage in hostilities they have a mission to accomplish in a very difficult environment against enemies who make that environment all the more difficult by their willful, deliberate, and systematic violation of the law. So my interest in this was to assist the generals in ensuring that their assessment reflected an accurate foundation of law. And they didn't need much help in that, to be very candid, because they had grown up in a culture that embraced compliance with the law, and they all had an intuitive instinct for the law. So a little polishing at the edges with terminology here and there was principally my function for the report that they prepared. My interest, whenever I see a report such as the one that was released today, was to look at it and ask myself, is this report accurately reflecting the true nature of both military operations that frames the application of law and the law itself? Because if it's not, and it's issued by an organization with the stature of the United Nations, then it can distort in the view of many others in the future what the expectation of law is in the conduct of military operations. And that distortion can have a debilitating effect, not only on the ability of armed forces to execute their mission, it can have a debilitating effect on their morale, because it creates this perception that no error is permissible in war, even a reasonable error, which is an unrealistic expectation. We tend to forget that the men and women who fight on behalf of democracies are moral human beings who come from a culture that respects life and are asked to do a very difficult and terrible function on behalf of their nations. And so distorting the reality of what the law demands from them can have a corrosive effect on their own understanding of their role in this dilemma, if you will. And ultimately, I think it distorts the fundamental function of the law to actually protect the civilian population. Because if we're not careful, what we do is we create a standard that actually incentivizes the exact bad behavior that endangers the civilian population. Because one thing is clear, no matter how illegal the conduct of an enemy may be in locating its vital assets in the civilian community or cloaking itself in the appearance of civilian, it doesn't eliminate the need of the military commander to execute the mission and accomplish the mission. So if we don't hold both sides accountable for their obligation to take measures to mitigate the risk to the civilian population, we're creating a false expectation that simply condemning the effects of combat will have a protective effect for civilians in the future, when in fact it has the exact opposite effect, because it encourages the enemy to create situations where a military that considers itself professional will have no alternative other than to engage in hostilities that produce that effect. So that's my interest, is to ensure that we understand that this balance has to be preserved. Now, I think the Commission's report deserves praise in the sense that it clearly recognized that what happened in Gaza was a conflict between two armed, organized groups, or maybe Israel, the IDF, and a group of armed, organized groups that were in a coalition. And that was an important point to start from, because that start point led the Commission to clearly indicate that all parties to that conflict bore an obligation to respect the law of armed conflict, or humanitarian law, whatever term you want to use. And we have to start there. This was not a conflict between an army and a group of civilians. This was a conflict between two belligerent groups. And as General Jones says, the generals who visited Israel noted that one of the interesting dynamics of this conflict was how it represents an evolution in non-state groups. We tend to think of non-state groups, insurgent groups, as completely militarily inferior to the states they're going to confront. And that's changing on a rapid basis. You just have to watch the news to see this. So this was a fight, this was a conflict, or in the very general sense, a war between two organized armed groups that were both bound to the laws of war. But at that point, I start to become concerned about the Commission's report, and particularly when I contrast it with the report that was prepared by these generals. So why do I have concerns, and what are the concerns? The why is because my concerns suggest that some of the conclusions, or many of the conclusions in the report, reflect an inaccurate understanding of the nature of military operations, and in some cases, an inaccurate understanding and application of the actual law that regulates military operations. So what are some of these flaws? First, I think there is some distortion of the controlling legal norms. The most notable example of this is what General Jones referred to already: the failure to clearly indicate that the distinction obligation is a dual obligation. It's not a unitary obligation on the attacking commander. The obligation extends to all parties to the conflict. All parties to the conflict have to take measures to mitigate the risk to the civilian population. The single most fundamental measure is to wear a distinctive emblem that distinguishes you from the civilian population, so that the attacking force is capable to effectively comply with its distinction obligation in the targeting process. And when an organization deliberately and systematically violates that obligation, it compromises the efficacy of the law's expectation that an attacking commander and an attacking force, an attacking soldier, can effectively draw those distinctions between civilian and combatant. Now, ironically, even in this context, fighting against an enemy that does, in fact, routinely and systematically violate this obligation, the IDF, in my view, and certainly in the view of the generals, took extraordinary measures to try and come up with solutions to this problem, and frequently at the expense of their own tactical initiative, and in many cases at the jeopardy of their own forces, by imposing rules of engagement that restricted the ability to use combat power until certain levels of certainty were established that the person you were directing your attack against was in fact a belligerent operative. But if the report fails to consider the impact of this systemic violation on the reasonableness of attack judgments throughout the campaign, and you can't divorce one from the other. You can't say that the attacking force has an obligation to distinguish the object of attack from the civilian population, or the object of attack from civilian property, without considering the fact that the enemy is deliberately and systematically violating its obligation for the specific purpose of complicating that distinction responsibility for the attacking force. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that a non-state group is disinterested in respecting this fundamental rule of law. That's one thing. But to ignore the effect of that violation on the broader assessment of compliance or non-compliance by the state party is extremely problematic, and I think undermines the legal foundation for many of the conclusions that the report reaches. I think that foundational flaw is also reflected in what the general noted, which is this, in the end, was a report that focused principally on the conduct of hostilities in close combat operations in an urban environment where you're fighting an asymmetric enemy that is highly capable, highly lethal, highly organized, but making no effort to respect the law. And to engage in that assessment without a solid foundation of military operational expertise to inform your judgments. And let me be clear, I'm not suggesting by any means that only a military professional is capable of making these judgments. But in terms of the factual foundation to support a judgment, you would think that the Commission would have a voracious appetite for the views of people like General Jones and the generals that accompanied him to Israel, like Colonel Kemp and the general officers that he's assembled on his group to assess the conflict. And yet in the report, all I've been able to see is one reference to a military expert who is not identified that assisted the Commission. We don't know what assistance was provided. We don't know the extent of the assistance. We don't know the nature of the opinions. And we don't know the background of this military expert. And I think that's very unfortunate. Because if a report like this is going to resonate with people in the profession of arms, they are going to look at the foundation in order to decide whether to give the opinion probative weight. Right? This is a basic axiom of opinions, right? The opinion is only as good as the foundation that supports it. So if you were to imagine that you were a general in the French army or the Danish army or the British army or you name it, and you got this report and you're looking at it trying to decide how significant of an influence this should be on my assessment of my future operations, consider how the fact that it was not sufficiently informed by military, not legal, military operational experts would influence your reaction to the report. And I think that's a flaw in the foundation. The other piece of this that I think is very troubling is the tendency to engage in what I've called effects-based judgments of military operations. And this is laced throughout the report. That our tendency is to look at the effects of combat and infer an ipso facto violation as a result of those effects. We saw it this morning in the presentation, actually. The terminology of massive destruction, overwhelming civilian casualties, the weighting of children casualties more than other casualties. This may sound, I mean, I hope it doesn't sound callous, but the reality is, if I'm advising General Jones, a civilian is a civilian. It doesn't matter whether it's a child or an adult. If it's a civilian, that's a protected individual, and we have to do everything feasible to avoid risk of inadvertent harm to that individual. But this kind of approach to the report suggests that what has happened is that because it is very difficult to recreate the tactical and operational situation that frames attack judgments, operational battlefield judgments. Why do you bulldoze a house? In the abstract, you can say a house is there and it's bulldozed, that looks awful. But if we don't back up and say, what was the mission? What was the enemy? What was the time constraint? What options did you have? What troops did you have available? What was the intelligence estimate on what was happening in that house? Was it booby-trapped? Were other houses booby-trapped? If you don't factor all of that into the equation, then you don't have the proper considerations to judge whether the effect you observe was in fact excessive or within the margin of appreciation that the law applies to a military commander in that complex situation. And yet what we tend to do, and I think what the report does frequently, is to rely on effects to draw an automatic conclusion or certainly a strong inference of illegality. That is extremely dangerous. Because imagine you're the non-state enemy. You are encouraged now and incentivized to create a tactical situation where the commander has no choice other than to produce the effect of destruction of civilian property and harm to civilian human beings, because you will take advantage of that by leveraging that as the touchstone of the immoral and illegal conduct of your opponent. And then the final piece of this that I think is so interesting is what I think is the failure to consider the kind of macro institutional commitment to the law or lack thereof to frame the way you approach individual incidents of potential violation. And by that, what I mean is, when I look at the IDF, when the generals looked at the IDF, they looked at an institution that made an extremely significant effort to understand and implement the law of armed conflict through training, through the involvement of military lawyers in every phase of the operational planning, execution, and assessment process, through extraordinary use of precautionary measures related to the attack, even at the risk of tactical initiative, through decisions related to timing of attack, selection of weapons, etc., etc. At a macro level, I don't think anybody can claim credibly that the IDF is an institution that is indifferent to human suffering or doesn't care about the law. And I'm not surprised by that, because the reason professional commanders demand that their subordinates respect the law of armed conflict is not just because it produces an advantageous strategic information benefit. It's because it protects the moral integrity of the men and women they are entrusted to lead into combat themselves. They have to deal with this terrible situation of life and death judgments, and they have to come out of it morally whole at the other end. And commanders intuitively understand that demanding understanding and respect for the law contributes to the preservation of that moral clarity. On the other side, you had an organization that not only didn't care about the law, took it one step further. They exploited their violations of the law in an attempt to neuter the combat power of their opponent, because they knew full well exactly what I just said, that the IDF was an institution that was going to demand compliance with the law, even in the most complex battlefield situation. To take advantage of that, they endanger the civilian population. And ultimately, if we're not candid about that, and if we don't express that clearly and the effect it has on the execution of military operations, we conflate cause with responsibility. Just as the general said, we incentivize the worst practices, we increase the danger of the civilian population, and we devalue the efforts of legitimate military forces to deal with this complex and difficult environment as best they can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Korn. As I've told you personally, and I'll say publicly, I wish you were one of my professors in law school.
And as I've told him, he hasn't seen my exams.
Before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to note that the Commission of Inquiry's report begins with a summary of how they were appointed in their mandate, and there are some things that are missing. The report says that the Commission appointed 3 members, Professor William Chavis, Mary McGowan Davis, and Dudu Dien, and then says later, following the resignation of Mr. Chavis, the report does not say why Professor Chavis resigned. It was, of course, because he was found to be in a undisclosed and concealed conflict of interest in that he had done paid legal work for the PLO on a matter of legal advice on how to pursue Israel for war crimes, and he had to resign in February. But it doesn't mention why he had to resign, but another little point that is missing is that, in fact, in August, the Commission did not begin, when it announced on 11 August last summer of the members of the inquiry, it did not begin with 3 names mentioned above. It actually began with the 3rd name of Amal Alamuddin, who's now Amal Alamuddin Clooney, wife of George Clooney. She was announced by the Human Rights Council as one of the original members of the inquiry. And of course, being the fiancée of George Clooney, she's also an attorney in London, but being the fiancée at the time of George Clooney, of course, the international media ran to her immediately on August 11th, and that was the lead story, was, tell us about this inquiry on which you're a member. And she said, I'm not on this inquiry. And this had never happened before in the history of the United Nations Human Rights Council. It had never happened before that they announced one of the members, a very famous person, at that, and she said, actually, I'm not a member. And there was this confusion for a week about what actually happened. And to this day, no one really knows what happened, and the UN never clarified whether they just announced her name and didn't tell her, or whether she changed her mind. We don't know. When she announced that she wasn't there, suddenly they're missing someone on the very day that they announced themselves. So it was quite embarrassing for the Human Rights Council, and that's why, of course, it's deleted from history. It never happened according to the UN history. But it did happen, and there was a time when they were missing a 3rd person, and they began to look for a 3rd person. Now, given that Professor William Chavis, on the day that he was announced, UN Watch published videos that were well known of him saying that the favorite defendant that he wants to see the entire world in the dock of the International Criminal Court is Israel's Prime Minister. And he was then appointed with the question of whether Israeli leaders bear individual liability when these videos became public, and the fact that for some 30 years he had called for the prosecution of Israelis as war criminals. And indeed, it wasn't that he needed to be paid money by the PLO to advise them, but on the contrary, he was publicly pressuring the PLO, to the PA, the state of Palestine, to sign the ICC and to join at a time when they didn't want to. So it wasn't that they were paying him for legal advice, he was actually pressuring them to be more aggressive against Israel, and in fact they were in Ramallah. So when all this became public, there was some pressure brought to bear upon the Human Rights Council to perhaps balance it. And something that hasn't been public before, but I want to share with you, is that the speaker that I'm about to introduce was approached by the Human Rights Council presidency to be on the panel. and was actually told that he would be appointed. And in the end, it never happened. So Colonel Richard Kemp is not only someone who submitted a major written submission to the Human Rights Council, to the Commission of Inquiry. He appeared before them at length, and he also submitted to them findings by a high-level group of 11 former military chiefs of staff, foreign ministers from Australia, America, Italy, Germany, and many other countries. And he was part of that group, and he presented those findings to them. And I'll now give the floor over to Colonel Richard Kemp to present those findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hillel. What Hillel didn't say is that I was approached by the President's Office of the UN Human Rights Council and asked if I would take part in this commission, and I agreed to. And I then was told I'd be hearing back soon, confirmation of it, etc. And I heard no more, but subsequently, via other sources, I was told that I had refused the appointment. So I don't know what happened. Obviously unintentional confusion.
And just to know one thing is that the Palestinian ambassador was interviewed on the media, and he said that the replacement for Amal al-Hudud will be a woman. And somehow, for some reason, the Palestinian ambassador had inside knowledge of who would be appointed. And indeed, a few days later, Miriam Davis was appointed.
And I wasn't prepared to go for the operation. Well, first of all, thank you very much to you all for coming and listening to us. And secondly, thank you particularly to United Nations Watch and NGO Monitor Hillel and Gerald for organising this event and for organising so smoothly the various other events that have taken place to try and get as far as we possibly can the truth out into the UN Human Rights Commission. So I really commend both of you for your efforts. It's a real honour to speak here today on the same panel as General Jones and Colonel Corn, both very, very distinguished military men. Of course, Britain and America, very strong allies. And I've met Colonel Corn before. We had the pleasure of speaking together. Well, I had the pleasure. I didn't say it's a pleasure for him. We had the pleasure of speaking together on a conference in Jerusalem. But having heard both him and General Jones speaking today, I'm just so pleased that there are two voices of sanity out there who are prepared to stand up and speak objectively about this situation, because there's so few people who are prepared to do so. So it's an honour to be sitting here. There's been a little bit of a build-up recently, which probably has been met by dismay in some quarters, of people who are prepared, experts, who are prepared, it seems, to stand up and tell the truth about what's been happening in Israel and Gaza. And I've already mentioned, and you've heard the readout from General Jones and Colonel Corn's group, obviously a very important group, visited Israel, came up with the opposite findings pretty much of the United Nations Human Rights Council. There were two US lawyers, and I'm afraid I've forgotten their names now, but two US lawyers recently, I think about a month ago, published a very compelling report about the Israeli legal system, how the Israelis apply the laws of armed conflict, the laws of war, and how they investigate allegations of either breaches of the law of war or other forms of misbehaviour by Israeli soldiers. It's a very powerful, strong report. And indeed, we heard in November last year, we heard General Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most powerful military man in the world, saying that Israel had taken extraordinary steps to save the lives of innocent civilians during the Gaza conflict, having himself sent out a delegation, a fact-finding delegation from the Pentagon. And finally, we have a group which we call the High-Level International Military Group, which I was a part of. I was the lowest level of the high-level group, but it was made up mainly of former chiefs of staff of a number of national armed forces, generals, a former ambassador responsible for investigation of war crimes for the United States, and a former national security advisor. We had 11 members of that group, representing 7 different countries. United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, Holland, Spain, Italy, Australia and Colombia. There are other members of the group as well who weren't able to come with us on that visit that we made to Israel in May. We were led in that mission by General Klaus Naumann, who is the former Chief of Staff of the Bundeswehr and former Chairman of the NATO Military Committee, which is the most senior military officer in NATO. And we also had with us Giulio Terzi, the former Foreign Minister of Italy. So it was a powerful group. They were completely independent. No one told them what to say. Contrary, no doubt, to various accusations and speculations, they were not in the pay of the international Zionist conspiracy. Unfortunately, it'd be nice to. They were essentially, like General Jones's group, they were a group of highly experienced professional military officers going, applying their own knowledge, experience and insight to what had happened in Israel. They had unique access to the Prime Minister right the way down to military commanders fighting who fought the war in Gaza during that conflict. I'm just going to briefly, I'm not going to go through this in detail because actually it won't surprise anyone probably to know that the major findings of that group were very similar to the findings of General Jones's group, because of course these were people, well, there was one American general among them from the US Air Force, but they weren't all Americans, but they were all pretty much all NATO allies, and therefore we used to operate into similar doctrines and had similar experiences of military operations. So it's hardly surprising that they essentially came to very similar conclusions. After the report they will produce, they've only produced an interim report so far, they will produce a more detailed report in the autumn. But I'm not going to therefore go through all of those findings again, because we've heard pretty much all of the things they come up with, but I just want to mention a couple of key ones. And one thing that sort of struck me really from their interim report was the comment made, and this is, as I say, from senior officers representing 7 different national militaries. And they said, the Israel Defense Force employed a series of precautionary measures to reduce civilian casualties. Each of our own armies is of course committed to protecting civilian life during combat, but none of us is aware of any army that takes such extensive measures as did the IDF last summer to protect the lives of the civilian population in such circumstances. Now I agree with that comment as well. And I think partly it's not really, I don't think, just because anyone's suggesting that the IDF is better than any other army. I don't think anyone would suggest, any one of us would suggest that. What I think the point is that in relation to the Gaza conflict, tragically the IDF have had immense practice at fighting this kind of conflict in this exact area, too much. And not only that, but they also, whereas the British and American forces will fight in huge areas of Afghanistan, vast areas of Iraq, places like Libya, in the case of the Americans now even Syria, and other countries around the world. So we don't quite have the focus on a single small area that the IDF managed to have on the Gaza Strip. The intelligence they were able to collect on it, the expertise they had on it, the long knowledge, lengthy knowledge they had, enabled them, I think, to take their moral standards, their laws, and bring the two things together and come up with a series of very detailed measures that few other people would be able to accomplish. I mean, if you're fighting, let's say, the Battle of Fallujah, is it likely to be reasonable you'll know the phone numbers of all the houses there and be able to ring them up or send text messages to people or contact, make contacts to trusted intermediaries? No, it's not likely, but it was possible and it did happen in Gaza. So I think that's part of the reason why that was the case. But whatever the reason is, that was the case, and I think quite a striking finding from that group. Another thing that struck us all was the extent to which the IDF went in restraining themselves from carrying out attacks against confirmed Hamas targets when they knew that civilians were present there and would result in disproportionate death. Even to the extent, and I'm not going to repeat the cases now because I was told some of this stuff in confidence, but even to the extent that Israeli Defense Force restraint on attacking targets resulted in the deaths of Israeli citizens during that conflict because the targets weren't struck. I'm not saying, again, that's unique. That is not unique either. In British and American forces, there are a number of occasions when we have restrained ourselves or taken, in some cases, deliberate action where our soldiers have died to save the lives of civilians. So it's not necessarily unique, but it is something worth bearing in mind. It's something worth keeping in one's mind. And the second kind of striking point, I think, was the immense effort that the IDF went to, which I don't think, as far as I know, is mentioned in that report, and I have read it, but I don't remember seeing it. The immense effort the IDF went to deliver humanitarian aid to the citizens of Gaza. They enabled the passage of vast quantities of humanitarian aid into Gaza. They maintained electricity supply, they maintained water supply. And it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that. That act has two major disadvantages. One of them is that very few armies in the world, when it's carrying out active, lethal military operations against an enemy that's trying to kill you, very few armies in the world will then resupply that area, knowing that much of that resupply will get to your enemy. And knowing also, when you carry out humanitarian ceasefires for the purpose of resupplying the civilian population, that it gives the enemy an opportunity to regroup, to reposition themselves, to lick their wounds, and to get ready for the next round. That is something that few commanders would actually consider doing, I think, in most circumstances. The second aspect of that, which again few people know and is not well publicised, is that the crossing point that was used, the main crossing point was used into Gaza, came under repeated attack from Hamas while the IDF was bringing humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip for Hamas's own civilians. Attack after attack after attack. Threatening Israeli soldiers, of course, and the Israeli civilians who were involved in manning the crossings. So, again, you know, and they carried on, they still did it. So is this the apartheid state? Is this the state that's responsible for war crimes we've heard about repeatedly in the UN Human Rights Council this morning? In fact, I would say that the thing that struck most of us in our group in Israel last month was that what we saw, and many of the officers that were there, probably I would say most, if not all of the officers that were there, I was probably an exception in having significant experience of observing, seeing and working alongside the IDF in the past. Very few of them had done that. And they were quite surprised, I think, by the extent of the measures that the IDF took. And we all found that it wasn't just the general view that you see expressed in the media or in the United Nations is a bit offline. We found it was the diametric opposite of what the reality is. That not only was the IDF not deliberately, as a matter of policy, trying to kill innocent civilians, but going further than most people, most armies in this world would contemplate going to save the lives of civilians. That's all I want to say about the report. I just want to mention a couple of other observations about the high-level international military group report. I want to mention another couple of points quickly. The first one, in fact, what I want to do now is I want to read to you the testimony that I gave to the UN Human Rights Council this morning. Don't worry, it only takes 2 minutes. In fact, it took 2 minutes and 10 seconds and I was cut off before I finished in my prime. But I want to read it because I think most of you probably weren't there, which I think you're probably quite pleased about. What I said was this: Mr. Vice President, I fought in combat zones around the world during 30 years service in the British Army. I was present as an observer throughout the conflict in Gaza. During the entire 2014 Gaza conflict, Hamas, to its eternal shame, did more to deliberately and systematically inflict death, suffering and destruction on its own civilian population, including its children, than any other terrorist group in history. Hamas deliberately positioned its fighters and weapons in civilian areas, knowing that Israel would have no choice but to attack these targets, which were a clear and present threat to the lives of Israel's own civilian population. While the IDF made efforts unprecedented in any other army and exceeding the requirements of the laws of war to save Palestinian civilian lives, including warning them to leave target zones, Hamas forced them to remain in those areas. Unable to defeat Israel by military means, Hamas sought to cause large numbers of casualties among their own people in order to bring international condemnation against Israel, especially from the United Nations. This was the cornerstone of Hamas's strategy. It was Hamas's strategy, not illegal Israeli action, as this report shamefully alleges, without a shred of evidence, that was the reason why over 1,000 civilians died in Gaza. And by denying this truth and by refusing to admit the manifest reality that the conflict in Gaza was caused by Hamas's war of aggression against Israel, this report faithfully reiterates Hamas's own false narrative. The Council has for too long allowed itself to become a tool of Hamas's murderous strategy. By unjustly condemning Israel, by refusing to condemn Hamas's repeated and unprovoked aggression, this Council has consistently validated and encouraged Hamas's tactics. I urge all the delegates to this Council to reject this report. Failure to do so amounts to support of Hamas terrorism and will result in further rounds of violence in Gaza and Israel. The price for that will be paid in the blood of the people of Gaza and Israel. That was the main emphasis that I wanted to make. Obviously, I had about 4 hours worth of points I wanted to make to the UN Human Rights Council, but Hillel wouldn't allow me to. But I think I just wanted to, briefly, I'm conscious of time, I just want to touch on a couple of miscellaneous additional points. The first one that I found quite shocking about this report is the way in which this report treats the Israel Defense Force and Hamas as equivalent. Moral equivalence. It is morally bankrupt to do that. There is no comparison between the two. The Israel Defense Force is the legitimate army of a democratic government in a Western liberal democracy fighting to defend its people. Hamas, on the other hand, is a ruthless terrorist organisation, prescribed as a terrorist organisation around the world, intent on subjugating and suppressing, brutally suppressing and repressing the people in Gaza, and also intent on the destruction, by its charter, intent on the destruction of a member state of the United Nations, in other words, Israel. So what is the comparison? It's like comparing the United States Army and the Islamic State. Of course there's no comparison. How can a United Nations body that we pay our taxes to keep in business, how can it draw that moral equivalence between the Hamas and the Israel Defense Force? The IDF is not perfect, and the General, I think, Colonel Corn mentioned it just now, but the IDF isn't perfect. They make mistakes, like our army, like the British Army makes mistakes. There are errors of judgment made by commanders in the heat of battle, or because they've got too little sleep, or whatever it might be, but there are errors of judgment made. Mistakes happen as a result. There's a very big difference, again, between somebody who's sitting in a command centre in Tel Aviv directing air operations and somebody who's actually pinned down in the alleyways of Shajaria in Gaza with shell fire around them, with people sniping at them, with machine guns, with the possible of suicide attack, with maybe casualties being taken, with the fog of war and everything that you know about and associate with war. There's a big difference between the kind of judgment you can make in those circumstances. Equipment goes wrong. You know how often does your computer freeze? How often does some microwave in your house not work properly? Do you have microwaves in Switzerland? I don't know. But this stuff all goes wrong. And of course it goes wrong 10 times as often in the heat of battle. It's missiles that cost thousands of pounds that are supposed to hit a target will go over there. Radios break down at the critical moment. Command and control systems fail. Intelligence fails. Intelligence, I spent a lot of my time working in intelligence, and I can tell you intelligence is an art, not a science. And more often than not, actually, it's wrong. That may be a slight exaggeration, but I think the reality is that even the most sophisticated terrorist organizations, intelligence organizations, often fail to produce an accurate result. So, and also every army has bad soldiers. I'm sure the US Army doesn't have any bad soldiers. But the British Army certainly has its share of bad soldiers, and the IDF, I'm sure, does as well. And they make mistakes because they're not very good at their job, or because maybe they're malicious. You were handing me something, tell me to shut up. Okay, I've got to shut up now. I'm going to finish off very briefly. I will shut up. I'll just say finally. I mean, I think the UN attitude towards Israel, so much of the media attitude towards Israel, the intention of the BDS movement to try and use things like the Gaza conflict to delegitimize Israel, to force Israel into the International Criminal Court, to ruin Israel internationally. It reminds me of a situation maybe back in the 30s where Western nations were appeasing the Nazis. This is like that, except it's like what's happening with this lawfare campaign is like the Western nations appeasing the Nazis and at the same time trying to prosecute the Poles who are trying to fight the Nazis off. That's the way I see it. Anyway, I apologise for going over time, and I'm now finally going to shut up.
It's always a treat to hear you, and I just want to note that after hearing 6 hours earlier today of Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, Pakistan, Venezuela, and other members of the UNHRC pronounce themselves on human rights, the juxtaposition of the words of truth that we've just heard is rather stark, but I'm glad, and I'm sure you're all glad for the experience. All of the presentations you saw will be posted on our YouTube channel, and I want to, at this point, thank all of our expert panelists on this panel and on the previous panel for making the trip to be with us here in Geneva on this important day. I want to thank the partners for this event, GINSA and their director, Michael Bukowski, for their cooperation. I want to thank staff at UN Watch. I want to thank our co-sponsor, NGO Monitor. I want to thank everyone who's been watching this live webcast at home, and all of you who came here today. Thank you very much.